Well, good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We have people still in the line signing in, and I know that we'll have others trickling in during the course of the morning, but for those of you who were prompt and got here on time, we want to reward you by getting started. I'm Bob Hathaway. I have the pleasure of running the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. I want to welcome you. Thank you for coming. This is being webcast, which means, among other things, that when you later in the day have an opportunity to ask questions and engage in conversation with the speakers, we're going to ask you to wait until we get a microphone to you. Since there are others watching this who are not physically in this room, let me just say a word about the Woodrow Wilson Center. We were created by the U.S. Congress in 1968 as the nation's official memorial to Woodrow Wilson, the 28th American president. Woodrow Wilson, prior to becoming president and prior to entering politics, was a political science professor. One of the nation's best known and most widely respected experts on the U.S. Congress, and subsequently became president of Princeton University. Woodrow Wilson is the only American president to have earned a Ph.D., and the center seeks to commemorate through its residential fellowship programs and through an active series of conferences such as this one and other public events, both the scholarly depth and the public policy concerns of Woodrow Wilson. I want to get us started. I'm going to vacate the podium very promptly, but before doing so, I want to thank a couple of people. I want to thank, obviously, those of you who have gotten out of bed and away from your home, perhaps earlier than you normally do, to join us this morning. I particularly want to thank the speakers, some of whom are up here, others of you are still in the audience, but the speakers and the other panelists who will be with us during the course of the day, a number of whom have traveled long distances to be with us. I want to acknowledge my Wilson Center colleagues in the program we call STAGE, which is the program on science, technology, America, and the global economy, who have co-sponsored this event with us. STAGE is ably directed by Kent Hughes, sitting in the back of the room. I also want to acknowledge the help and publicly thank our two other partner institutions in this enterprise today, the Center for Economic and Policy Research and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. I think you'll be hearing from representatives of both groups during the course of the day. And lastly, I want to acknowledge the really extraordinary work done by Bhumika Machala on the Asia program staff, who originated the idea of this conference, who designed it, who identified the speakers to bring to you today. Several people have already told me this morning what a great conference they think we have gotten together, and I've had to say perfectly honestly that Bhumika did all the good work. So Bhumika, with that, we'll turn things over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome today morning to the 10th anniversary of the Asian financial crisis. This year, 2007, marks 10 years since the onset of the Asian financial and economic crises of 1997 to 1998. It was a watershed event in recent global economic history, which had significant impacts on national economies as well as on the ideology of globalization. The Asian financial crisis was not only a financial crisis, but also a human crisis and a crisis of globalization. Decades of economic progress in East and Southeast Asia were jeopardized as the levels of poverty, unemployment, and social inequality soared in the most affected countries. 10 years onwards, it is now imperative to re-examine and reassess the debates on the Asian crisis in light of the recent changes and developments in both the international and regional financial architectures. It is an opportune time right now to revisit the fundamental causes and drivers of the Asian financial crisis, assess the recovery paths of the countries that were most affected and the new challenges that have emerged in these countries, clarify the lessons learned from the crisis, and highlight how the next steps forward are being charted within Asia and globally. Each of the three panels today offer a distinct area of focus. The first panel today offers an analysis of three countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Korea. The second panel focuses on international financial and economic globalization, and the third panel looks at regional initiatives and policy directions. The panelists here today represent a very diverse range of perspectives and positions, and this is a key aspect of what makes today's conference particularly unique. The differences in the analyses of the panelists will indeed produce a richer and more complex discussion of the Asian financial crisis. I will now also want to mention that there will be a post-conference publication that will be produced after this conference in the months ahead. This publication will have papers from each of the 9 panelists here today. In order to ensure that you will receive this publication, please do remember to fill out your contact information on our Wilson Center sign-up sheet outside the auditorium. Furthermore, I want to let you know you can access this conference in the months ahead through the video archive, which will be located on the website of the Wilson Center's Asia program. Finally, I want to recognize and thank the individuals in the co-sponsoring organizations as well as the Wilson Center who have really been instrumental in turning this initial idea several months ago, back in almost November or October 2006, to turn this initial idea into a reality today. I'd like to thank Bob Hathaway and Michael Kugelman from the Asia program, Dan Beaton from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, as well as Mark Weisbrot, and Matthew Wright and Keiji Iwatake from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So thank you all for coming today, and I am sure that this is going to be an extremely rich and unique conference today, and look forward to having substantive interaction with our expert panelists as well. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Mark Weisbrot of the Center for Economic and Policy Research for a brief introduction before the first panel starts.
Thank you, Bhumika. Thank you very much for all your work in organizing this. I don't know if I need that. I'll be very brief. We all know that I also want to thank, by the way, the Wilson Center and Dan Beaton, who worked on this as well, and all the others who helped. We all know why this is so important an anniversary, so I won't belabor that. It was one of the formative events at the end of the 20th century, and it generated a huge discussion about international capital flows and financial crises, and unregulated financial markets, and globalization became the big buzzword. And there were all kinds of proposals for reform, ambitious schemes for a world currency, for a world bankruptcy court, international financial regulator, sweeping reforms of the IMF. And none of this happened. So 10 years later, we have probably more unregulated financial flows with the explosion of financial derivatives and the expansion and proliferation of hedge funds than we had back when that crisis occurred. And for reasons that will be discussed here, we've been fortunate enough to avoid the kind of financial crises that we had in the late 90s. But I want to say that and these reforms, of course, these proposals of reforms, I think people forgot that it took a Great Depression and a World War II, to get the Bretton Woods system, and so there just wasn't enough incentive, I think, at the top. But something else did happen. There was a huge epoch-making change. It was really the biggest change in the international financial system since the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1973, and that was the decline in the power of the International Monetary Fund, and by extension the U.S. Treasury Department. And this was a huge change, and this is what I will talk about on the second panel. It was a change that people were not really, except for a few of us, were not advocating or anticipating, so it was different from the reforms that were discussed at the time and for years later, but it turned out to be extremely important. Anyway, I won't give away any more of the story, so we can go directly now to our first panel. Thank you all for coming, and I think it should be a great discussion.
We're going to start off the first panel talking, obviously, about what did happen. There's a tendency in Washington not to look back and see what went wrong in some major event, but rather to look ahead, or in some cases try to avoid the problem altogether. And therefore, Bhumika has designed the first panel to look at the causes, effects, and results, and some of the lessons learned from that not quite cataclysmic, but serious and extremely costly event. I don't know whether remembering the Asian crisis is perhaps the right title, because it's not something that anybody should look back at with fondness because of its both economic and social costs, both in the region and its broader ramifications for the international system. But we have with us three distinguished people to talk on this subject. We're very pleased that they're here. I'm not going to give you their long biographies. They're in the package that you've been given materials here, but they are quintessential examples of action intellectuals, people who are deeply involved in the policy area as advisors, as officials of international institutions, and also distinguished scholars in their own right. And it's precisely the kind of people that we have on the panel who are highly qualified to lead off the discussion of what did happen and what are the lessons for the future. The first speaker is Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who's Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs. As you'll see from the bio, he's also the author of a number of distinguished books and edited others. So he has a great deal to say about this issue. Second speaker is Dr. Soedradjad Djiwandono, who's former governor of the Bank of Indonesia and now emeritus professor of the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Indonesia. I mean to ask you, as I'm a senior scholar here, whether being emeritus means you're working much harder for much less money. I think so. But I can talk about that with you afterwards. And the third speaker will be Meredith Woo, who's professor of political science at the University of Michigan. And the interesting case, of course, is that, which I'm looking forward to hearing her on, is, of course, wasn't supposed to happen to Korea, which is one of the Central Asian tigers, and the question of why Korea went through such travails and the lessons for the future will be very important. Each of the speakers will speak around 20 minutes. I will give them a polite reminder when 15 minutes is up. And we'll have them speak, as Bob Hathaway said, in order, and then we'll open it up for your questions and your dissents. Remember that you're on the camera, so you can run outside and call your mother or mother-in-law and tell her to tune in to the webcast, and it will be archived by the Center for Future Reference. So I'll turn without further ado to Jomo to lead off.
Thank you very much, John, for those kind words of introduction. And let me thank the hosts, Wilson Center, the Center for Economic Performance and Policy and Research, and as well as the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Since we have very little time, let me get straight to the point. We have been invited here to speak about the causes, effects, results, and lessons from the Asian crisis, and I'd like just go straight to the causes. Of course, the causes are quite variegated, but I think it is useful to focus on two particular aspects. And most importantly, after the world economic recession in the early 1980s, induced by the Volcker reforms, we had a situation where basically what Ken Rogoff has called financial globalization was promoted by various quarters, most importantly by the business media, but also very importantly by the International Monetary Fund, among other institutions. From the mid-1980s, following the debt crisis of the early 1980s, this process gained some momentum. And in Southeast Asia, it took particular forms. Southeast Asia was perhaps less affected. Very few of the countries in Southeast Asia borrowed as extensively as countries in Latin America, and so they were not subject to the same policy conditionalities. But nonetheless, Southeast Asia undertook a series of 3 devaluations, and I'm referring to 3 devaluations in Indonesia. In Thailand, there was a single devaluation in '94, and in Malaysia, there was a process of depreciation of the ringgit from after the Plaza Accord of September 1995. These devaluations were accompanied by other elements of domestic and international liberalization. I will just mention a few elements which you might recall. In Indonesia, for instance, in 1988, there were the so-called Sumalin shocks, which led to a number of reforms. In '91, it became possible for people outside of Jakarta to borrow directly from foreign sources. It was possible for foreign banks to have offices not only in Jakarta but also outside of Jakarta, and this basically meant the ability of the central bank to exercise any degree of authority and effective surveillance basically was undermined. There was a proliferation of banks between 1988 and 1997. Before 88, there were less than 100 banks. By the time of the crisis in 1997, there were more than 240 banks. In Thailand, the process really picks up momentum after the Suchinda coup of 1991. Following this, the new authorities installed initially by the military and subsequently by the king basically were induced to believe that Bangkok could become a major international financial center, especially after Hong Kong would revert to Chinese rule from 1997, and the authorities were encouraged to undertake a number of new initiatives. Most importantly, after the restoration of parliamentary rule, the Bangkok International Banking Facility was established in '93, and in 1994, the Provincial International Banking Facility. So it basically meant that if you were in a relatively outside of Bangkok, if you were in Hat Yai or you were in Chiang Mai, you could basically access international finance without necessarily going through the effective authority of the central bank. In Malaysia, the sequence was very different because of a fairly serious recession in the mid-1980s, a banking crisis in the late 1980s, which led to a tightening of regulatory control with the Banking and Financial Institutions Act of 1989. At the beginning of the 1990s, there was an attempt to try to generate much more capital market activity in Malaysia, with the split between the Stock Exchange of Singapore and the Kuala Lumpur Stock Exchange. The Malaysian authorities at that time basically went around on what were called roadshows, trying to induce foreign investors to invest in the Malaysian stock market. And this is very important because they were very, very successful in their efforts. And in '92, there was a tremendous influx of money following into '93. And then towards the end of '93, there was a reversal of this money, and resulting in a collapse of the stock market. And at the beginning of 1994, the finance minister at that time, Anwar Ibrahim, basically introduced capital controls on inflows. And these controls were subsequently lifted in the second half of '94 due to effective lobbying by those with a strong interest in seeing a very dynamic stock market. One should also remember that in 1992 there was a very significant, Malaysia experienced a significant loss due to the collapse of sterling. Because the Malaysian authorities had put much of its reserves in sterling, which was at that time offering a 17% interest rate. And after the 1992 elections, when John Major got re-elected, the sterling was dropped after an attack led by George Soros. And this, of course, resulted in a great deal of animosity, which lasted for over a decade between Mr. Soros and Prime Minister Mahathir. In Korea, there were also similar, there were different types of developments. From 1988, Korea lost its most favored nation status. In 1993, it joined the OECD. And as even advocates of financial liberalization, such as Ron McKinnon, have acknowledged, they did it all wrong in terms of the sequencing. One of the first things they did was actually a capital account liberalization, which enabled those who are managing finance for the Jaibols and others to access international finance and to lose their mission of sort of focusing on industrial development. So basically, you see by the mid-90s different types of vulnerability in the financial systems of these four economies. But something which had perhaps not been well understood, the phenomenon of herd behavior among investors, especially foreign investors, basically meant that the collapse of the Thai baht on the 2nd of July 1997 basically had neighborhood effects. There was what was called contagion. The crisis spread to the rest of the region, and subsequent developments in Indonesia as well as in Korea basically attained a new significance because of the context in the region. The whole situation was, of course, exacerbated by two very important institutions. Firstly, financial markets themselves. Financial markets tend to be pro-cyclical, and the various institutions of financial markets basically exacerbated this crisis. So on the one hand, when times were good, money was sloshing into the region, and unlike much of the rest of the developing world, the East Asian emerging markets attracted a great deal of money in the early and mid-1990s, but they made a very hasty retreat from 96 in the case of Thailand and the rest of Southeast Asia in 1997. Now, recognizing this, I think, is extremely important because it is the larger context in which the crisis takes place. The crisis was exacerbated by the policy influence of the fund in various different ways. This is now widely acknowledged and not really the subject of any controversy. The fund was very much influenced by what we call the first and second generation currency crisis theories, and basically they forced the East Asian governments to have fiscal surpluses in dealing with the crisis, and instead of trying to react to it much more counter-cyclically. It basically recommended the raising of interest rates to try to attract capital from abroad, which basically meant that liquidity was tightened and you basically squeeze domestic businesses and undermine them. They insisted on, in the middle of a crisis, redefining the rules of the game. For example, making it tough, tightening the time period during which a loan would be considered a non-performing loan. And as a consequence of these measures in the second half of 1997 and early 1998, you had an increase in bankruptcies in the region. Now, from the beginning of 1998, there was a recognition that the whole analysis was flawed. There was a lot of criticism, a lot of debate, and there was a recognition that the analysis was flawed. And beginning from early 1998, you see a remarkable change. In January and February 1998, three of the most influential people in the world of international finance basically changed their story. The first, of course, was Alan Greenspan, who basically talked about the problems of corporate governance in Asia. The second was Larry Summers, at that time Deputy Treasury Secretary. And the third person was Michel Kamdesu, the Managing Director of the IMF. And their statements basically contributed to a new focus on questions such as corporate governance, such as cronyism, and so on and so forth. And this became the new mode of analysis, and reform of corporate governance became the rallying cry for reform in East Asia in response to this crisis. In countries like Korea and in Hong Kong, where there were very strong shareholder movements, this gave rise to sort of a shareholder-led movement. But elsewhere, it was really very much led by the authorities, led by the elite. Now, by 2003, the fund had basically acknowledged that it was flawed, it was wrong in what it did. There were two major mea culpas in managing director, the new managing director, Horst Kohler, now the president of Germany, when he visited Malaysia, basically reminded Malaysia and the world that they had, under Article 8 of the Articles of Agreement of the Fund, basically had the right to exercise capital controls on outflows, especially in emergency situations. Very importantly, also, Ken Rogoff, the chief economist of the fund, in a couple of articles with other fund staff, basically acknowledged that what they termed financial globalization had not contributed to economic growth in developing countries, and instead had exacerbated volatility and instability. Now, let us quickly review what happened in the region in terms of the responses. In countries like Thailand, in fact, had a protracted defense of the Thai baht from 1996 at least, when the signs that Thailand was adversely affected by the Chinese abandonment of a dual exchange rate and having a single exchange rate. Thailand basically responded, came under attack. The Thai baht came under attack. And at that time, I think it is fair to say that the Quantum Fund, led by Mr. Soros, did play a significant role. In the case of Malaysia, after the crisis broke in Thailand on the 2nd of July 1997, there was a period of about 3 weeks where the Malaysian government basically spent about 9 billion Malaysian ringgit, at that time worth about $4 billion, trying to defend the ringgit unsuccessfully, and then eventually gave up. Other countries in the region basically did not try to defend their currencies and therefore did not lose as much money in the process. The IMF, basically the economies in the region responded after that in ways which were basically influenced very much by the fund and by prevailing market sentiment. And the exception probably was Malaysia, where it tried to do a number of things to try to stem the consequences of the crisis. But by the end of 1997, after a falling out within the Malaysian political elite, there was basically a brief period when fund type policies became much more influential. I should also mention that during the third quarter of 1997, there was a very important initiative by the Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs of Japan, Mr. Sakakibara. And Sakakibara basically had proposed the idea of what was termed an Asian monetary facility, with about 100 billion in resources to try to deal with the crisis. This was basically rejected by the dominant elements in the fund, and to a lesser extent initially by the Chinese government, Chinese authorities as well. The third type of response, beginning from around the second quarter of 1998, was to try to reflate the economies in the region through fiscal means. This was due to the abandonment of the earlier influence of currency crisis theories. And different countries adopted these methods at different periods, and there was also the attempt to try to, different types of devices were introduced to try to bail out certain parts of the economy rather than to simply allow bankruptcies to manifest. Now, in mid-1998, there was a very important revision in American attitudes towards the Asian crisis. The first year was probably characterized by at best, what might be called benign indifference. But by mid-1998, there was a sense that this crisis was not simply an Asian phenomenon. It might spread to Latin America. Brazil was adversely affected, and Russia was being adversely affected. And in an important speech in San Francisco, President Clinton basically talked about the need for a new international financial architecture. Now, by the end of August and beginning of September, of course, the Russian crisis had reverberations on hedge funds activities, particularly on long-term capital management, and this resulted in an intervention, a private sector bailout, but coordinated by the Federal Reserve of New York for LTCM. And this basically created very new conditions. It basically legitimized the whole idea of bailouts in very important ways. And also, I should emphasize that the Fed reduced interest rates in this country, and this led to a flow of funds to the East Asian region, which then contributed in turn to a fairly rapid recovery from the last quarter of 1998. So you basically had what might be described as a V-shaped recovery from the last quarter of 1998. Although in the case of Malaysia, the recovery stalls, seems to begin from the second quarter of 1999, although I would suggest that this is due to the way statistics are read. It actually begins a little earlier in the first quarter of 1999. Another very important factor which helped the recoveries, particularly in Korea and in Malaysia, was the expectation of a Y2K problem. For those of you old enough to remember, there was an expectation that computer systems would all drop, would basically collapse. Because they were not able to deal with the fact that at the beginning of the year 2000 you would have 000 on your computers. Now, basically, then we have also following this, beginning from about 2000, a beginning of some degree of regional financial cooperation, quite unprecedented, I should add, for this region. The so-called Chiang Mai arrangements, I would say that these were extremely clumsy and conditional on having an IMF program requirement. But as you know, a week and a half ago, there was a very important, there were important meetings around the Asian finance ministers, and particularly the Northeast Asian finance ministers from Japan, Korea, and China, basically agreed to multilateralize the Chiang Mai arrangements. So instead of these very, very complicated arrangements, you basically have a multilateralization, and there is also a possibility that it will no longer be conditional on an IMF program. There have also been other efforts, stepping up of efforts to develop an Asian bond market, and for at least 6 economies in the region, there has been a big trend towards what is called self-insurance. I think it's a bit of a misnomer, but basically it means the accumulation of huge amounts of reserves. And basically, I would suggest that this means that these reserves are often deployed in ways which generate relatively low incomes, but also, very importantly, are not available for much more productive investment purposes. And this, I think, is a real shame. The other element which I think is worthwhile mentioning is that over the last couple of years, there has been talk about an Asian investment bank, comparable to the European Investment Bank, or CAF, which is the Andean Fund. And basically, it would make available much more resources for investment purposes. The Japan Bank for International Cooperation has estimated investment requirements for the region in the range of about 200 billion annually. And right now, the Asian Development Bank offers less than 15% of that. So the potential for such a facility, it seems to me, is quite considerable. But unfortunately, there are other factors, including this imperative to develop, to ensure oneself through building up these huge reserves, is standing in the way of that. Now, let me finally conclude by identifying what are the lessons which have been learned and the lessons which have not been learned and the lessons which should be learned. I think we have more attention to crisis prevention issues as well as crisis management issues. But I would suggest that that the fundamental problems have not really been brought on board, despite the publication of articles such as the paper by Rogoff and his associates. There is not yet a recognition, an institutional recognition by the fund and by others who are important, that financial globalization has fundamentally exacerbated the problem of financial crisis, and the need to develop new ways and means to be able to contain to contain the likelihood of crisis, and in the event of crisis, how one can better manage those crises. Thirdly, regional financial cooperation is moving very, very slowly, and it seems to me that it is unlikely that regional financial cooperation will become an adequate alternative to global institutions. And I think we need to begin to directly address this question, to begin to explore the ways in which we might have a much more effective regional financial cooperation, but also inter-regional cooperation, because there are different regions in the developing world, especially who face different types of problems, and there's a need, I think, to broaden this cooperation, if you will. Now, we do not have much recognition, unfortunately, that capital flows have not really, with financial liberalization, there has not been a significant flow of capital from the north to the south as was promised. Instead, except for very brief episodes such as the early and mid-1990s, the actual flow of funds continues to be from the south to the north. Second, and of course, we know now that the single largest foreign aid program is basically through the U.S. Treasury bonds, as Ken Rogoff has reminded us, where many developing countries are basically contributing to buying U.S. Treasury bonds and lending to the United States at very low interest rates. Secondly, the cost of funds has not really significantly declined due to financial liberalization. Undoubtedly, the recent period has seen much lower interest rates, but this has been due to a variety of other factors, including the efforts by the Federal Reserve in this country to try to respond to the 2001 downturn. Thirdly, we also find that financial deepening has not necessarily contributed to a decline in volatility and instability. In fact, with the advent of hedge funds and a number of other new recent phenomena in the last decade, it has become much clearer that financial deepening can actually exacerbate volatility and instability rather than reduce it. Finally, what are the real lessons, or what are the lessons which should be recognized by the major institutions and the major players? Firstly, I think we should recognize that macroeconomic policy, as well as related policies in the area of finance and so on and so forth, should be clearly and unequivocally counter-cyclical rather than pro-cyclical. Secondly, particularly in the developing countries, there should be much more policy space for expansionary macroeconomic policy. The current range of policy conditionalities and the other circumstances conspire to actually reduce that potential. Now, the last few years has undoubtedly been very good for developing countries, but this has been exceptional because of the low interest rates I mentioned earlier, as well as the high commodity prices. Thirdly, I think it is very important that we revisit the whole issue of development finance institutions at the national level as well as at the regional level. There is a need to develop development finance institutions. Again, many of these development finance institutions have been wiped out or considerably contracted due to the reforms which have taken place over the last quarter century. And finally, I think it's very important that we begin to think. Last year the Nobel Prize was given to Professor Yunus for microcredit, but I think the real challenge is to begin to think of a much more inclusive domestic financial systems, where the whole range of those in need of credit will be served. Right now, we have a situation where the large corporations have no problems getting finance, and the small and the poorest might have access to preferential finance of the UNOS type. But a great number of people in between basically have very little access to finance. So we really need to begin to think about these kinds of issues if we are going to be serious about learning the lessons from the East Asian crisis and moving forward in developing financial institutions which are much more conducive to development. Thank you very much.
Jomo, that was a marvelous introduction to the issues and looking forward, so I thank you. We'll turn to our second speaker, Dr. Djiwandono. The floor is yours, sir.
Good morning. First, I would like to thank the Center, Woodrow Wilson, and also Sasakawa Foundation for inviting me to be here with you all. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is my second time actually talking here at the center. In 1999, I was invited, I think it was in the same room, to talk about the crisis. It's called 2 years after the Asian crisis and what next. And now, 8 years later, sorry, can
everyone hear in the back? Yeah, good.
What is the name of the file? Is it this one? Okay. Bigger. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you for my illiteracy in technology. So after about 8 years, I come back here again talking about remembering the Asian financial crisis, and sure. How could I not remember? I'm still part of the almost like feeling like victimized by the crisis itself. So let me try to chip in after excellent presentation by my good friend Jomo. I also would like to give you a little bit descriptive analysis of what has been happening in 97, 98 and after, and the policy response as well as how it affects development in the regions, and have we learned from the crisis. As we all know, it started with what happens in Thailand in July the 2nd, when the Thai baht was depreciating tremendously after its floats, which later on followed by contagions in the regions. And the crisis, as all we know, aside from the region and Asia, it also in the end happens in Russia, in Brazil, in Turkey, in Argentina. And maybe when we talk about part of the LDCM, actually it's all over the world. We actually could see that Mexican crisis 94 is related to what happens in Asia, but the difference was that the Mexican crisis didn't really followed by a contagion, while Asian crisis followed by a contagion. So maybe there's a question as to the why. And on the contagion itself, aside from the conventional way of defining contagion, that it is the crisis that's spreading geographically in the economy. So I, from observing of what happens to my own country in Indonesia, it actually also spreading from one activities to another, from one sector into another. And in Indonesia, it's from financial and the banking crisis to the whole economy, and after that to social and politics. So contagion is not just spreading between areas, but also between sectors of activities. And when right now, after 10 years, I think Professor Ito from Tokyo University just wrote a paper, so I just would like to repeat. And he's sort of trying to describe what happens during that very crucial period by looking at what, he talked about epicenter, maybe thinking about earthquake, which one is really sort of leading during the crisis. And apparently there was some change of the epicenters from July to September. When you talk in terms of the depreciations of the currencies, the leader of the depreciation was the Thai baht. But after that, actually Thai baht was a little bit stabilizing when Indonesian rupiah and Korean won took over from September to February 98. And after January 98. But after January, actually, the epicenter was really in Indonesia. So when you look at from July to September, actually you can almost like classify several countries in the region. That's the Thai baht were suffering the depreciations the most. And then after that, Malaysian ringgit, Indonesian rupiah, and the Philippine peso, which more or less depreciated about the same magnitudes. And after that, Singapore and Taiwan, which depreciated just very little, while China renminbi and Hong Kong dollar didn't depreciate, partly because it was fixed and pegged and they can defend that. But by December 97, the cumulative depreciations of the Korean won and Indonesian rupiah were bigger than the baht. That is when the epicenter moved from Thai to Indonesia. And I agree with the observation by Professor Ito that this why the epicenter actually changing actually demonstrates that there is a failure of how the initial policy response done by respective government, or for government who went to ask for help to the IMF by the respective government and the IMF. So we should also note, when we look at what has been happening, that there are both similarities and differences. At the beginning, when you talk about the macro fundamentals and also the so-called vulnerability indicators, prior to the crisis, there are differences and there are similarities and differences from each. And also the policy response, whether it's the immediate policy response as well as on a later period when the crisis was going on, there were similarities as well as differences, as also after the IMF involvement from countries who went to ask for help to the IMF. Maybe just give you a little bit later on, because some of the analysis showed how the difference between one to the others. Some of the things that seems to be very important over here is that when people talk about, for instance, about the exposure of the private sectors, you can see actually that the corporate debt to equity in all these crisis countries, Indonesia, Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia, were high. Maybe Malaysia is the lowest, but Korea and Indonesia were very high. And when people talk about the cronyisms, the ersatz capitalisms, there's a statistic of showing that the family company, and if you add state company, the percentage are also high. And as we say in Indonesia, it's much higher than other countries. Also, a very prominent figure here is the ratio between the short-run debt to the reserve. Indonesia is very high, and all of them actually were high. So, actually, it's what happens. Most currencies started to stabilize in mid-98, but Indonesian rupiah took the worst beating. So Indonesia did not just become the new epicenter of the currency crisis, but also experienced a different type of contingence, as I just alluded to. That is that it spreading from the exchange rate to the banking sector, and after that to the whole economy. And after the whole economy was suffering, then it became a social and politics. And as we all know, it is culminated in the downfall of Suharto, which ended the 32 years of rule, which actually have a good economic achievement as well as a very tragic failing. Now, when you look at the whole impact, again, Indonesia actually is faring the worst. When you look at the nominal exchange rate depreciations, or you look at the real exchange rate, or the growth rate, and the stock exchange, etc., all of them shows that all this Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, and Thailand, they have problems in '98. But Indonesia is faring the worst. And the so-called V-shaped recovery, as Jomo also mentioned, we can see that both in the GDP as well as the other indicators, that but the currency depreciations, except for Indonesia, as I said, stopped in mid-98. And by the end of '98, all currencies except the rupiah of Indonesia had bounced back as high as 75% of the previous loss of depreciation. And in '98, all crisis countries in Asia experienced a negative growth of GDP. Indonesia was the worst, 15% negative growth. But by 1999-2000, all crisis countries except Indonesia again were on the way to recovery. So when I look at the Indonesian case, it is really unique in terms of the fact that despite the economic conditions prior to the crisis was either as good or as bad as other countries, but it suffered the most after the crisis. And Indonesia also coming out last from the crisis, as well as the recovery actually has taken a very slow. Now, academics are still debating on how to explain this. But recently, the debate turns to a different direction. When the academics started to get impatient of this slow process of recovery and reform, others were actually delightfully observing the fact that actually Indonesia only experienced a negative growth of only once in '98, even though 15%. But after that, the growth rate of GDP kept rising to the present one of close to 6%. And this has been achieved together with democratic process that runs well. Maybe this is a matter of how you look at whether the glass is half full or half empty. Some people are very optimistic about what's going on because other countries have to suffer much longer negative growth with the process of democratization. But of course, if you are in Indonesia, the people are getting more and more impatient because of the muddling through of the recovery. So the V-shape of economic downturns and the recoveries, as has already been established by many, right now is still, there's one more characteristic that I would like to address to. That is that the average growth rate of GDP, the post-crisis, is between 4 to 6% in the Asian countries, except China, have been lower than the pre-crisis, 7 to 9%. this phenomenon is related to the debate whether the pre-crisis was the normal pattern, which implies that most countries have not been back to the pre-crisis level of growth, or that the post-crisis growth is actually the normal one, and that the pre-crisis growth was an aberration. Maybe we remember Paul Krugman's argument about what happened in Asia, and as Jomo mentioned about the fight between Prime Minister Mahathir and George Soros, also actually with Krugman at that statement. But in terms of currency depreciation, the pattern has been that when the crisis hit, the currencies depreciated fast, and after different policies to address, the currencies started to move back. But most currencies didn't reach the pre-crisis level, meaning that they have been sort of appreciating after the drought, but all of them has not really gone back to the pre-crisis level. Singapore dollars and Korean won were like close to 100%, 95% of the pre-crisis level. The Thai baht and Malaysian ringgit recovered to the level of about with 30% discount, so 70% back to the pre-crisis. But the Philippine pesos was only 50%, and Indonesia is faring the worst. It's only 25% of the pre-crisis level. So, despite their stability, both investment and exchange rate have not been back to the pre-crisis achievement. So when now when we talk about addressing the crisis, as we all know, academics try to theorize and explain the whole thing, you know, the so-called first generation, second generation, third generations balance sheets and others. And actually, I would like to look at that. That most debate actually look at whether the causes of the crisis come from the national or inside domestic economy, or whether it comes from the outside. And when I look at what happens in Indonesia, and I think also in some other countries, it is my contentions that the causes of the crisis are both external and domestic. The rapid depreciations of baht after the flood serve as a trigger for rupiah to depreciate fast. But it developed into a crisis due to the structural weakness of the banking sectors and actually other institutions. So I think there may be some questions that would Indonesia be spared from crisis had there been no Thai baht crisis? I would argue that yes, indeed, it will still be a crisis, partly because the Thai baht depreciation was only a trigger point, but the trigger point can come from other kind of things, even social unrest, partly because Indonesia at that time was almost like getting closer and closer to really erupting into the crisis. And all these were actually complicated further by inconsistent programs and the implementations, be it just by the government, respective government, or for those who are asking for IMF help by the government and the IMF. And different arguments have been put forward on the specific causes of the crisis in Indonesia and in others, but that include whether it was right in the first place to invite the IMF as contrasted to Malaysia. The debate is still on right now, especially as the game of blaming who is at fault and why the crisis happened. My own take is that inconsistencies of policies or policy implementations committed by the government as well as by the IMF and the private sector, both foreign and domestic, actually all of them are at fault. So I like, actually this is not my word, one of my colleagues from Korea some time ago describing Korea is sort of saying that the crisis is homegrown but not home alone, that's what he said. And inconsistency in the government's actions, and to a certain degree the IMF in its role in the fund-supported program, ultimately destroyed market confidence. And after all these countries, beginning 80s and really 90s, all of them are really gearing up towards the market economy, the so-called Washington Consensus. And in the economy, from financial shock to banking in distress and crisis, through balance sheet, and in the end to the whole economy. So the confidence problems also involve the social structure and political system as well as the national leaderships, and that's how it happens in Indonesia. And as we have observed, all economies in Asia launch policy responses to the crisis from the first time it started, and the post-crisis and the recovery and the depression. And it was, I alluded before that the contagion with changing epicenter showed that the immediate policy responses by the countries actually failed. But after the IMF involvement, then there is actually joint work between the governments and the fund. Later on in the discussion, I can show in more detail which area that I think whose is falling more than faulting more than the others. So actually, a careful look at the policy responses to address currency shocks and crises, as well as policies for recovery, shows that we cannot really generalize about this country's experience. And even despite all the regional effort to coordinate policy for stopping the deteriorations and creating a turning point for recovery and beyond, each country in the end follows its own path. So it is actually a country-specific kind of policy responsive. And even those who are asking for help from the fund, the package are different one from the others. But to me, the most important thing is that it should be some timely recognition and admittance of the problems, which is actually the most difficult for most government, because many of them are always in a self-denial or a business-as-usual attitude. And in the end, prompt actions to come up with workable adjustment policies, or the sooner the better, since we are facing with contagion. And of course, consistencies in policies as well as policy implementations are very important. And in a globalized world, since all of these countries are open economy, when the world are growing better, these countries are also always being helped. And in post-Asian, the most prominent issues in policy right now has been how to manage the national economy with capital account in the midst of free flows of huge amount of funds that could come and go the way it happens during the crisis. I think Jomo also mentioned about some of the regional as well as the multilateral arrangement, reform, new infrastructure, etc., etc. I guess when we look back, all of them actually there's the so-called new paradigm. I just skip to all this, and when to the questions, have we in Asia learned the lesson from the crisis 10 years ago. Well, indeed, some did, and some other have not been doing yet, or not yet at all. But as Stan Fisher, the first deputy managing director of IMF during the crisis, who is now governor of the Bank of Israel, just before he left IMF, he reminded all of us that actually all parties has to learn from the crisis, and all parties involved actually are the national government, the multilateral agencies, IMF in particular, and also the World Bank, and also the private sectors, both the national as well as the foreign, the host countries as well as the foreign corporations. I guess all of them has been trying very much with a different kind of architectures. But I think I would like to join the introductor in the introductions that it has not really been going that far. And in the meantime, we have been facing with new kind of development. Part of what I've been saying, the fact that the growth rate, even though in that V shape, right now we have not really been mostly, except for China, achieving the pre-crisis. Part of it is because we also have been observing very low investment in Asia. This is, of course, very closely related to the recent kind of debate, the so-called global imbalances, and the debate of where the cause of that global imbalance is. You know, the argument between the U.S. Deficit, the twin deficit, in comparisons to the saving glut plus negative or deficit investment in Asia, and very little saving in this region. That kind of thing is very closely related to what has been happening post crisis. I think in terms of how we, or the economists, whether we have been learning through all these lessons, I think we will still be having a couple of hours today to look at the other speakers, how they be faring with this kind of issue. Thank you very much.
I think you're getting a very rich menu of presentations, so we'll turn to the last one on the Korean case. You need help with your PowerPoint?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay.
Good morning. Thank you for coming to this conference, and it is a great reality check to be in a conference room full of people who remember the Asian crisis as if it happened yesterday. Because normally when I'm in my classroom, I'm dealing with students who return a blank stare at me when I talk about Asian financial crisis, and then I remember that this happened when they were just barely beginning their grade school. This financial crisis that we're here to remember was, of course, liquidity crisis in the context of, as Jomo talked about earlier today, very rapid and quite possibly ill-advised financial liberalization that occurred around the world, especially with rapidity in Northeast and Southeast Asia. And in this crisis, you had all the requisite dramatic persons, the herds of institutional investors, money managers, and I don't recall who it was who said that there's nothing more sordid than capitalists who are panicking. And then there was also a lot of finger pointing. Suddenly people discovered the useful phrase crony capitalist, and journalists, Wall Street Journal, and policymakers were doing a lot of finger pointing at the so-called crony capitalists for having caused the problems. And then there was, once again, as Jomo said, a set of maybe ill-advised policies to deal with the crisis, which often looked like they were designed to do demolition derby on small enterprises, which suddenly couldn't deal with the high interest milieu that was imposed on them. Nonetheless, it was also a real tragedy, as Bhumika said. This was a tragedy as people were kicked out of their jobs. This was a true human tragedy as well. But when all is said and done, and 10 years have passed, we ask ourselves, what in the overall scheme of things did it all mean? Let me take a particular license today to change gears and offer a very different perspective than the ones offered earlier. Let me say that the Asian crisis was quite perhaps, we might think of it as a historical marker. It was a historical marker for an epoch that got swept away or that went up in flame, and this is a metaphor I'm going to be using throughout this talk. It went up in flame, and it opened an era in East Asia, which was actually a quite old order, and that is the Sinocentric world order. Symbolically, we might recall that the Asian crisis really got started or triggered when the Chinese devalued their yuan. And that caused all kinds of mayhem that ravaged the area for a long time. And so one way to think about what this marker looked like, what it marked, I think is a transition to an order in the region which was becoming dominated by China. And in that case, the question that confronts the area, the region today, is how to live with this incredibly dominant country which is coming into its own. So today I'm going to do a lot of conjecture, a lot of guesswork, a lot of sci-fi, in fact. And since I'm going to be talking in sci-fi mode, let me talk a little bit for inspiration. Let's turn to one of the least known sci-fi work written about a century ago by a great American writer, Jack London. It is so little known, or perhaps because the story is so mean, that it is often dropped out of the collected works of Jack London. The story is called Unparalleled Invasion, and it was written in the first decade of the 20th century, a sci-fi that sort of imagines what the world might look like a century later. And as the story goes, Jack London says that China was growing all throughout the 20th century at the needs of the Japanese. And Chinese scored spectacular economic growth. And Chinese were mostly concerned and focused on manufacturing, and Japan, lo and behold, seemed fairly content in becoming a niche economy. Japan was focusing on basically aesthetics as its great competitive advantage, cultivating things like bonsai, and seemed entirely content, while the world watched with weary eyes at the great manufacturing explosion that was taking place in China. But it also realized that China was primarily interested in economic and commercial expansion and not in military or political expansion. Well, the story ends, as it turns out, that the world, after having watched the spectacular and quite often threatening growth of China, you saw airplanes departing from the United States to drop turkey feathers over China, and within 2 weeks, the nation we used to know of as China was wiped out. So this war was completed in 2 weeks, and Western nations after that gathered together in Versailles to declare never again and to place ban on genocide. Now, why do I mention this story? Because when I read this little-known story, I was struck by two things. That was in Jack London's mind, that he illustrated in the story. One is his emphasis on the relatively peaceful nature of Chinese expansionism and their utter lack of interest in military expansionism, because he went on at some lengths talking about the bizarre phenomena that the Chinese were not interested in developing a large blue water navy. So the fact that China isn't militarily interested in expansionism is true today as perhaps when the Chinese fleets girdled the globe before Columbus. And I think that probably remains essentially same. The second thing that I was interested in when I read the story was essential continuity in the bafflement that the world feels about how the world can best accommodate these relentlessly energetic people with great commercial genius who happen to be something like over 1/6 of the entire population of humanity. This kind of bafflement was true of Jack London's time as it is true today, perhaps even truer. So having said that, let me get back to 1997, 1998. I said that this was a true marker, a historical marker. But what was the order that this marker was demarking as having ended? Well, that was a post-World War II order. And this post-World War II order was marked, number one, politically by the Cold War. It was an order that was marked by American support for, whether they liked it or not, for military stability, which quite often meant dictatorships, all the way from South Korea down to Indonesia. If the South Koreans played with or implemented for a long time industrial policy, which we didn't like in Washington, we nonetheless let them do that because South Korea was an important country during the Cold War. And whether or not you liked Suharto, he was way down there, didn't seem all that important. And above all, he maintained political stability in Indonesia. So that Cold War order, defined by American support for political stability, came to an end around 1997, 1998. Another pillar that came to an end at that time was the Japanese dominance in Southeast Asia as well as in Northeast Asia. The Japanese signed reparations with Southeast Asian countries in the late 1950s. And by 1965, the Japanese signed reparations and put the past aside with South Koreans. And their influence in Southeast Asia grew, probably peaked around the time of the Plaza Accord when Japanese yen was king, and probably peaked also, maybe one might even go far, as Jomo mentioned, when Sakakibara willy-nilly sort of mentioned the idea of Asian Monetary Fund. And then, of course, it was shut down promptly by Washington. This era of Japanese dominance, which reached its height around the time of Plaza Accord, also came to an end with the financial crisis. The third pillar of this epoch was the setting for the so-called Asian miracle of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and Southeast Asian miracle that occurred in the 1980s. This artificial setting that also came to an end was the setting in which China had been sequestered from the world market. 4 decades of Chinese isolation and sequestration had come to an end in a very big way. And so in some sense, the post-World War II order in which other Asian countries did very well was a land in which it was like the land of the blind where one-eyed man was king. And that era came to an end. So in some sense, the severity of the transition from the old or post-World War II era to the new era, the best metaphor for that was actually, I think, what occurred climatically all throughout Asia. If you recall, 1997, 1998 were the years of what are considered one of the worst El Nino Southern Oscillation episodes in the 300 recorded history of El Nino Southern Oscillation. You had drought that ravaged all the way from Mongolia, Tibet, and North Korea down to Indonesia. And the ravage of this natural calamity that accompanied financial calamity that occurred throughout Asia cannot be underestimated. In North Korea, it scorched the earth so thoroughly and completely. The drought caused, in the end, upwards of 1 million deaths. Of course, that wasn't the only reason, but I'm just using it as to illustrate the kind of disaster that occurred. And of course, in Indonesia, while the financial crisis was going on, in the land, in the forest that was tinder dry, you had forest fire that ravaged for months on end, covering the entire Southeast Asia in smoke and haze. Now, when the smoke, fire, and haze finally cleared after so many months, East Asia was a new place. It had finally entered, after the haze, into a new epoch. In Indonesia, what came to an end was 30 years of the so-called New Order, which we might call all in the family, where in the name of having fought against, let's say, communism or maintaining Indonesia free of communism, that Suharto had given some, has enacted economic policy which contained large element of rural subsidy and whatnot, and that was finished. In Mahathir, you had the prime minister. In Malaysia, you had the prime minister standing on his hind legs, crying wolf in the wilderness. The only problem was that he was probably the wrong prophet, and the wrong prophet also chose an enemy that was bigger than himself, such as Mr. Soros and international financial community, and this was really the prelude to his final political demise. Economically, what all of this meant was that the so-called manufacturing miracle that occurred in Southeast Asia from the 80s came to an end, and we will never see the repeat of this kind of manufacturing miracle. The earlier speaker talked about 7 to 9% of growth that was based on manufacturing, as versus the 4 to 6% that's going on today. Why has it come to an end? Because there isn't very much that Southeast Asia can produce that can compete effectively price-wise, quality-wise, with the things being produced in China. And Southeast Asia is not in the innovative front of anything very much. So you have an end of an economic epoch never to be returned. In Korea, now I'm asked to talk about Korea, so let me finally get to the area that's interesting. And of course, there is no one Korea, there are two Koreas. So let me talk about two Koreas, especially since the two Koreas went through massive transitions also at the same time. When North Korea came out of a different kind of crisis, and that's the ecological crisis that scorched the earth by 1998, it became a transition economy. After having suffered the Holocaust of upwards of 1 million people dying, and after having suffered the entire breakdown of the entire communist supply delivery system, unable to feed its people, it basically became a transition market economy where people basically truck and barter in order to make a living for themselves. It also became a country, in another sense, transition economy, entirely and totally dependent on the Chinese. You go to the so-called market in North Korea, there's not a single thing you realize that North Korea is capable of producing. Even the Kim Il-sung suit that everybody wears, the drab suit, is made in China. It's really amazing how, in the context of no factories that work, that with great alacrity, with the speed of light, that became North Korea became part of, in effect, Chinese economy. In South Korea, too, a transition occurred. And since we're shifting gears, let me say that this is a transition from being an economy which had dual hegemons in the form of US and Japan, to being an economy which is now very much interdependent with and relying on U.S. and China. The dependence on China on the part of South Koreans is, of course, clear when you look at the economic statistics. South Korea is one of the largest, biggest partners with China in terms of trade and investment. But also South Korea relies greatly on China for political advice and support in dealing particularly with issues of North Korea. Both China and South Korea have a great stake in not rocking the boat for a number of very complicated reasons, which of course is understandable if you have a country with a nuclear ambition stuck right in the middle of both China and South Korea. But this is a dicey proposition to have South Korea get so close to China and perhaps to go back to the old Sino-centric world order. So the South Koreans have made a conscious decision that they have to steer themselves clear from falling completely back into the folds of the Chinese, and which is why, in fact, the South Koreans have pushed very hard for the free trade zone, free trade agreement with the United States. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be alienating a great partner like the United States just because China is an overwhelming presence, casting a very long shadow over North and South Korea. So Koreans have kind of made the bet that they don't even care if South Korea might end up looking like the 51st state of the United States. They have a pretty good calculations they have worked out about what they have to gain from this free trade, and I think their calculation is pretty good based on the kind of national champions and industries that they can be competitive in, but basically putting a lot of eggs in one basket known as human capital, which South Koreans feel that they're pretty confident about. How is it all going to end up? We don't know. We'll see what happens in July when Congress votes on this trade agreement up and down. But regardless of what the decision is going to be on the part of our Congress here, as well as the South Korean Democratic populace, undoubtedly the big task before Koreans in the 21st century is the question of carving out a measure of political and economic independence while they deal with very important partners for economic and political cooperation in the 21st century, namely United States and China. Thank you.
Well, you've gotten three very rich presentations. I must say that I will now go back and look up the Jack London story. Fascinating. So the floor is open. We have microphones, and as you know, we're being webcast. So I'll recognize people as I see them, and please wait for the microphone and identify yourself. Gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Mike Billington from Executive Intelligence Review. You mentioned that the IMF has acknowledged that the policies failed in terms of the recovery, but it could be argued, I think, that one of the intentions of the IMF policies was to undermine sovereignty, especially allowing the foreign takeover of the mostly nationally run banking systems across Southeast Asia, which was very successful, except in the case of Malaysia, I think, because of the controls. But I wonder if you could comment on that, the effect on the sovereignty as a result of the conditions that were imposed across the region. And a second question related to that is that the massive reserves that Jomo referred to has created it was meant to be a way of getting out from under dependence or security against another locust raid. But in fact, it's created a new kind of dependence, especially with the busting of the housing bubble and the probable end of the yen carry trade, meaning a severe dollar crisis, a threat to the banking system in the West. And Asia seems caught by the fact that they are holding this massive amount of dollars. So if you could comment on both those sort of sovereignty questions.
Jomo?
Thank you, Mike. On the question of sovereignty, it's a difficult question to. It's difficult to establish that the IMF, in and of itself, is interested in undermining sovereignty. I think what even conservative economists such as Jagdish Bhagwati have tried to establish is that there's a nexus between the fund and the Treasury, U.S. Treasury, and Wall Street. And what they would suggest, and Robert Wade is going to speak in the next session, he has also made this argument, what you have with this nexus is an interest in undermining sovereignty insofar as it might be in the interest of particular financial interest, the dominant financial interest. You often have a situation where the dominant financial interests do not necessarily have identical interests. And that's when you often have the state and other international authorities playing the role of arbiters. It's not clear that Western banks have necessarily strengthened their positions in East Asia by taking over national banks. In fact, if anything, it has been Asian banks which have taken over Asian banks. I think what has happened, and this precedes the crisis, has been through policy advice, a particular view of the world basically was promoted as desirable for Asians, and Asian financial authorities bought into this view of the world. The Asian crisis basically undermined this view of the world, and so you find, as a consequence of that, a great deal of suspicion in much of East Asia about the fund. The fund has basically lost credibility in much of East Asia, just as it is beginning to lose credibility in the southern cone of Latin America. And so you have a crisis of the fund, but the fund is also having difficulty with other parts with other elements of finance. If you look, for example, when the fund recommends that Europe undertake policies to reflate the European economy, or the fund undertake policies to reflate the US economy as it did in the early part of this decade, the Wall Street Journal, which is also representative, which I would say which is quite representative of particular types of financial interests, writes editorials severely reprimanding the fund for interfering in sovereign affairs of either the US or Europe. So I think it's a much more complicated situation. But I think this question of the fund of sovereignty is important. The fund, as you know, is currently facing a situation where it is pushing through with some reallocation of its quotas, and this process, I would suggest, has very little credibility among many developing countries. But the greatest resistance is now coming from the smaller countries of Europe. And the US is quite happy for some of these quotas to be changed as long as it retains its effective veto power. It is the only country which has effective veto power when an 85% majority is required. As to the second question of the reserves, I do think that we now find an ironic situation where the Asian economies, which have accumulated significant reserves, are now have a shared interest with the US in propping up the US dollar, in preventing the US dollar from depreciating. But there are also interests in the US who see the imbalances being addressed necessarily through a depreciation of the US dollar. And one should remember that since the end of the Bretton Woods system, this is the third attempt to depreciate its way out of a crisis. The first thing happened, of course, when Nixon did so from 1971, as Mark Weisbrot reminded us. The second attempt was the Plaza Agreement, when basically the Japanese were told to appreciate their yen against the US dollar. And now we have a third situation, which is basically being led by the US to some extent and involves the G7. But the major parties involved who are being asked to appreciate their currencies are not part of the G7. So you have an illegitimate framework for dealing with international monetary and financial affairs, namely the G7. The IMF has basically lost authority and lost legitimacy and is unable to address this problem. So we have a very dysfunctional system. Okay? But as Mark reminded us at the beginning of this session, in the case of Bretton Woods, it took 15 years, a world war, and the Great Depression to bring about the transition from the gold standard to Bretton Woods. And since 1971, there has been no concerted effort to try to address the problems of the international monetary system. Whatever has happened on an essentially ad hoc basis. And so this is a very, very serious problem. And unfortunately, we do not see the political will by the major currency issuers to try to address this problem in a way which is desirable in terms of sustaining growth in the world economy, and which is equitable in terms of ensuring that the North-South Gulf is closed.
Very interesting. That's very good. Well, I had a question back here. I'm trying to be even side, but the gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the World Affairs Council. I wonder if the speakers would spend a little more time addressing the political standing of the national leaders back in 1997 and 98. It seems to me that Suharto was already greatly weakened by 97 through the acts of his kids and other cronies. Mahathir was actually pretty strong, which enabled him to take actions that were firm and decisive. And the governments of Korea and Thailand were somewhat weakened, but the timing wasn't bad for a change of government in each country that enabled new governments to take decisive act. So I think the political side is more important than a lot of people recognize.
You'd include the U.S. in that political side, too. Do you want to respond to that question?
Okay. I guess first on Suharto, indeed, in 97, as you said, it was already weakening. That's why I said that for Indonesia, the bath depreciation is only trigger point. And in my opinion, the trigger can come from different kind of source, and Indonesia would have a crisis. I travel a lot in Indonesia, and in talking to the local people, you know, the feeling of anti-government, anti-Suharto, anti the family were really very rampant, actually. And the demonstrations, which was becoming culminated in May riot, actually started much earlier. From December 97, for a couple of months in most Indonesian campuses, there were always demonstrations, very small, but they did it almost like giving up the momentum, such that the momentum really came out in May after Suharto partly obeying to the IMF suggestion of raising the price of gasoline or reducing the subsidy. Then the eruptions actually sort of uniting all the elements against him. Now, also actually in relations to the previous questions on the sovereign, the way I see also is that if you look at the regime, even IMF, actually the recognition coming after change of regime. When Kandasu and Stan Fisher was replaced by Kuller and Kruger and the others, then came the new Office of Evaluation, Independence of Evaluation Office. Those are all of them coming out after Kandasu left. Also, in terms of looking at the so-called structural conditionality, the issues of ownership of policy, all of them came after the change of regime in the IMF. When you look at the regimes, the way I compare to the other countries, in Indonesia, when we went to the IMF, and after, the regime was not changed for quite a long time. The first letter of intent was signed by Suharto regime. Actually, I was part of the signer. The second letter of intent was signed by himself. I think this very well-known, notorious picture when Kandasu was like that. I was not even invited, partly because I was already put aside by him. And after he moved out, it was changed by the market perception is the continuation of Suharto by Habibie. The change was only after, in 1999, when Gus Dur took over. That's a little bit different, the way I saw, of what happens in Thailand. When in August, Thailand asked for assistance. By December, there was a change of government. And in Korea, if I'm not mistaken, when the negotiation was being made, the incoming government were already sort of participating, such that in Indonesia, the change of regime was much later than the others, and partly why the muddling through and what I've been saying, it becoming a basket.
Do you want to add anything? You're the resident political scientist on this panel.
As a resident political scientist, let me stick to the theme that I laid out earlier, that there was a big change that occurred at this time. And politically, let's call it a sort of generational change of some sort. And I think that there was a big generational change that occurred around that time. And it covers just about all areas, countries like China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, in Northeast Asia, not to mention a number of changes that occurred in Southeast Asia. But let me stick to Northeast Asia first. You had really a new leadership that eventually came into place, devoid of the usual octogenarians who were part of the Cultural Revolution generation. For the first time, you had young people in their 50s, basically, not older than maybe early 60s, coming into power. They cut their teeth not doing internal political struggle, but they cut their teeth managing big cities like Shanghai, or sometimes dealing with far provinces, where they showed that they were tough in dealing with security issues. And by and large, their foreign policy has been low-key, not grandstanding, and cautious, and trying not to rock the boat, trying not to irritate the United States, and trying to deal with important issues like North Korea. In South Korea, too, there was a big generation change that occurred in 1998 with democratic leadership coming into place. These were people that cut their political teeth throwing rocks at authoritarian leaders and demonstrating on the streets. And their tendency also was to not rock the boat, it turned out, in terms of dealing with North Korea. And they found that it was easy to do business with the Chinese because there was a meeting of minds in political and economic issues. So on the one hand, you have China, Japan going through generation change, at least at the level of political leadership around that time. You also had essential change taking place sort of on the other camp in Northeast Asia, and that's the Japanese and the Taiwanese. The Japanese, throughout, let's say, after 1998, essentially took the posture that was increasingly more pro-United States, both in political, economic, and military sense. And of course, it culminates in the inauguration of Shinzo Abe, who's, once again, metaphorically, his grandfather was the man who passed ampo over the dead body of so many people that opposed it and wanted, above all, to change the Constitution, especially Article 9. And it was in around this time, let's say 98, 99, 2000, the Japanese began articulating that Taiwan is kind of part of Japanese concern in the area, which I think was a very dangerous statement to make. So on the one hand, you had meeting of the minds of the Koreans and the Chinese, and then you had the meeting of the minds of the Bush administration, United States, and Japan and Taiwan. I think that this is a sort of a dangerous split, one that's not that really was kind of needless, and I think that in recent months, sort of an attempt to try to bridge the gap that had developed as the result of this kind of split that occurred. But clearly, I agree with the questioner that there was a political change that occurred around this time.
Good. Robert Wade.
Robert Wade. I'm struck by the fact that none of the speakers and none of the questioners have shown much interest in specifically poverty. That is, what was the impact of the crisis on levels of poverty, and in particular, what has happened to levels of poverty, the poverty headcount in the recovery. Average income, we know, has gone up generally at the rate of 4 to 6%. But is it the case that there's been a sort of a ratchet such that the incomes of the bottom 10 or maybe 20% of the population have not gone up at that sort of rate, so that poverty numbers have not gone down in line with the increase in average income?
Jomo?
Yes. The reason I had 20 minutes to try to cover quite a bit, and I didn't feel that it was really central. Meredith made an important observation about the timing of the El Nino and following that La Nina. I think it is very difficult to determine exactly what the impact of the financial crisis was on poverty, as opposed to other things which were happening at the same time, including the climatic situation. The second point to be made is that, as I suggested, the crisis was resolved in many countries within 15 months. Okay, the recovery began by the last quarter of 1998. In Malaysia, it was protracted, but it started later in Malaysia as well, because of the very different nature of the crisis in Malaysia. It was not so much led by banking loans, but it had more to do with the stock market for various reasons, which I was hinting at earlier. Thirdly, I think you correctly pointed out the significance of growing inequality, but growing inequality is a long-term trend. It has very little to do with the financial crisis per se. And in fact, if you take Gini coefficients before and after the crisis, you might actually see a decline in inequality, because it is the relatively better off who suffer greater income losses or wealth losses, and as a consequence of that, there's a sort of wealth effect, negative wealth effect as well. So I know it has become very fashionable, particularly because of the World Bank experimented a great deal with what it called so-called social safety nets during the Asian crisis. And I think the evidence is now increasingly clear that the social safety nets are a very poor response, partly because you do not have the institutional social safety nets cannot just simply be created overnight. You really need a much more universal approach to dealing with poverty and to dealing with questions of inequality, rather than one which is so targeted. And there are whole questions of the cost of targeting as well as the efficacy or lack of efficacy of targeting, which come up in this connection. The last point I think which needs to be made is that if you look at increases in unemployment, even in Thailand, which some would describe as the epicenter of the crisis, the impact of the crisis on unemployment is actually relatively modest. So you have a situation of full employment before the crisis and continued full employment after the crisis as well. Now, this doesn't mean that hundreds of thousands of people were not affected, okay? But you basically had a situation where to look at the impact of the crisis principally in terms of poverty, I think there's injustice to the whole problem of trying to understand poverty as well as trying to understand the impact of the financial crisis.
Very good. Do you want to add to this? This is a very interesting question.
Yes, sir. I can say something about Indonesia. Indeed, I didn't mention about it. Actually, in my own paper, I have something which I put some figures, but when I put this table, I don't have any comparative figures for other countries, so I didn't put it. But of course, the crisis actually hit so much such that a lot of indicators like unemployment and the people living below poverty line, petty crimes, and things like that increasing almost like tremendously, at least in '98. And after that, because of the very anemic kind of growth for a couple of years, that's indeed the poverty actually is increasing for Indonesia. And actually part of the problem, as also mentioned by our colleague from Korea, the end of program which was subsidized before, after the crisis actually many of them were actually discarded, and that create a lot of problems, and also partly politically, because all the new orders, the Suharto's orders, were almost like duped as bad things, and even part of the good thing was from the past was also discarded, like village health centers and a lot of activities in the kampong and in the villages was almost like neglected for a couple of years. That actually create a lot of problems. And of course, after, because of El Nino and El Nina, and after the SAR, that with this kind of problems, it's very clear that the public health, which was actually improving substantially under the Suharto regime, was almost neglected for a couple of years. Only lately, with the new types of new social safety net program, there's some new improvement. But again, with a very anemic growth, the Indonesian people living below poverty line is bigger than before the crisis.
We've got time for two more questions, and then I'll ask our panelists to respond to those, and then others that they may wish before we end at 11 o'clock. Sir, you've been waiting patiently.
Thank you. Vasanto Chaudhuri from Elizabethton College, Pennsylvania, also Rutgers at New Jersey. I was very fascinated by the summary of the East Asian crisis by these three panelists. I have two questions, but because of the time, my first question is actually answered by Dr. Jomo, It was not a question on poverty as such, but it was about the safety net. The lessons learned or to be learned, I think that could have been stressed in your presentation, that social safety nets should be in place, the institutional mechanism that you were alluding to. So that is taken care of. My actual question is about the recovery, the V that you're talking about. And the economic growth has recovered, and the range of 4 to 6%, not the 7 to 9%. Could that be partly not because of the domestic or other external circumstances, because most of these economies were driven by export-led industrialization, economic growth? Okay, one of the factor could be the export. Now, in that market, emergence of China, of course, China entered since 1980, but the China's vigorous export growth has also probably cut short or reduced the power to recapture their market. So, as an explanation, could that V recovery, not because of domestic or international financial institution related, but partly because of external Chinese competitiveness?
That's a good question.
That's the question. Could that be due to the competition from China that these countries are facing?
Very
and
good.
Because they were dependent on export-led growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Eileen, do you want to ask a short question? One more down here.
Ilene Grabel, it's actually more of a comment. I thought the question on sovereignty was really fascinating, and I just wanted to weigh in briefly on that. I think when we think about the effect of the crisis on sovereignty, we have to think about it in two ways. One was the intentionality, and the other was consequences of the crisis. Did that undermine sovereignty? And I think on both counts, the crisis did undermine sovereignty of countries. When we think about intentionality, as was pointed out, Robert Wade's work, Jagdish Bhagwati's work, looking at financial interests and the attack on sovereignty, I think those are very compelling arguments. I think there's another dimension to the intentionality, and that is the intentionality on the part of the Bretton Woods institutions to try to isolate and undermine the ability of the East Asian countries to engage in state-led, autonomous development that involved high levels of policy experimentation and heterogeneity from the Washington Consensus model. And I think the crisis certainly provided the opportunity to try to isolate those countries and dismantle the kinds of structures that were so important to their own development strategies. On the consequences side, I think it's quite clear that the crisis had the effect of furthering the East Asian countries' integration into the global financial system, and as a consequence has undermined national policy autonomy. And the questioner, I think, raised a really fascinating point about the buildup of official reserves, and I think it's quite interesting and ironic that the policy that was precisely driven by the desire on the part of East Asian countries to protect their sovereignty, never again to have to deal with the IMF, has in a very interesting way, in fact, made them much more dependent on the U.S. and much less able to even criticize U.S. economic policies.
Well, I'm glad to know that you'll be able to answer all those questions in the third panel. I'm going to ask my colleagues on the panel to respond very briefly because we're at 11 o'clock, and Bhumika will chop off my head if I don't get you out of here on schedule. But let me start in the opposite direction from the opposite order that we had in the panel, and ask Meredith to respond any way you would.
Well, let me
briefly.
just say something brief about the sovereignty issue. Of course, in all these countries that we're discussing, the country that had the most highly sophisticated, well-developed system of industrial policy was South Korea. When the crisis occurred, I think that in spite of some resentment the Koreans had about the kind of policies which were imposed on them, I think that the sense was that this happened at the right time, at the right place, and that these reforms really could be used to bolster some of the weaknesses, problems that the economic system really did have. And I think there were a lot of reforms that really were enacted in a very meaningful kind of way. And that I think that corporate governance system actually has improved a great deal, and especially the government also has, as it was sort of getting out, even in a residual way from the business of industrial policy, transformed itself, transmogrified into a very effective regulatory state, which is much better than ever before in regulating economic activities in a meaningful way without sort of in your way kind of manner of telling people what to do. I think one very clear instance of it is, for instance, the way that South Korean government is going about trying to deal with this free trade agreement that the government has in place, using its great comparative advantage of economic policy making, sort of know-how that's been in place for the last 30 years. They have really worked out good responses and policies for dealing with the losers, expected losers in the free trade, compensating industries that are likely to lose out, compensating farmers, and things like that. And so I think that in terms of sovereignty, I think that it isn't really in the direction of lessening sovereign power, I think, as much as changing the shape of sovereignty into something quite else, at least in terms of economic policy making.
Thank you. That's very useful.
On the growth, why lower than the pre-crisis? Well, the both domestic and China were the problems. In the beginning, of course, when the crisis hit, it hit the export sector partly because of all these mismatches in currencies as well as in maturity, etc. But after that, the growth mostly come from actually, surprisingly, domestic. The consumption, not just in Indonesia, in most Asian countries, when the growth was low, the engines of growth are coming from consumption. Maybe we can have a debate of why, but that's what actually been happening. China, yes, indeed, it was. China was in competitions with Asian, ASEAN countries in general, partly because of the export growth, etc., etc. Also because of investment recipient, the ASEAN recipient receiving a huge amount of foreign investment pre-crisis, but after the crisis, most of the foreign investment came to China and to the cost of the Asian. But saying that, when the American and European growth was on the decline, actually China growth was almost like savior for ASEAN economy. I mean, now most ASEAN economies having China as part of their major trading partners, and also in the end in investment. So there's some dynamics on both sides, so both domestic as well as the foreign elements actually playing quite a lot on why the growth is there. But then the issue again is that whether the pre-crisis was a little bit pushed too much, and the normal is actually right now. This is another debate that people right now look at, despite all this amassing reserve, etc., etc.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jomo, you have a few brief reactions.
Very quickly, in response to Mr. Chowdhury, external demand was, of course, quite important. The world economy was quite buoyant. The U.S. economy was buoyant, and this helped with the recovery, certainly 98, 99, 2000. But, of course, 2001, the dot-com bubble came to an end, and that had negative consequences for the rest, for East Asian economies, especially those which were producing electronics. Secondly, I think it's important to recognize that through the course of the 90s, foreign direct investment went down and the proportion of foreign direct investment which went to China actually increased. Now, this is not so important for Korea, which has never really relied very heavily on foreign direct investment. It was very important for Southeast Asia. And also in connection with this, the proportion of foreign direct investment accounted for by mergers and acquisitions actually was about 80% during the 1990s. So one should not think of foreign direct investment as necessarily greenfield. The last point, Ilene Grabel raised the question of industrial policy and the undermining of industrial policy, and in response to Mike Billington's earlier point. And I think this is a very important point, but it's especially true of Korea. There are these stories, I think the Bluestein book and other books, other accounts have talked about not only the U.S. not only the IMF, but also the U.S. Treasury occupying one floor of the Shilla Hotel and the Japanese occupying another floor of the Shilla Hotel, all putting pressure and arm twisting the Koreans. But in Southeast Asia, industrial policy was not so well developed, and there was less pressure needed. And in many ways, it was voluntary for some of the Southeast Asian governments to give up the vestiges of industrial policy which they had. Thank you.
I want to thank my panelists, particularly as I was trying to give people plenty of time, which I did because I thought all of the three presentations were absolutely fascinating. And I'm happy to say that you will get all the answers to the next two panels. We've eaten into the break, so I can't. Bhumika, are you here? No.